There is a habit in this farmhouse that started with my grandmother and has not stopped since. Every morning, before the coffee goes into the pot, she would reach into a small clay jar she kept on the shelf above the stove and take out one dried clove. One. She would drop it into the grounds, not a handful, not a spoonful, one clove the size of a finishing nail. I asked her about it when I was a boy. She said her mother did it. Her mother's mother did it before that. She could not tell me the year it started or who first thought to do it. She just said that coffee on its own left her heart running a little fast and her stomach feeling tight by mid-morning, and that the clove changed that. It evened things out. She said it in the matter-of-fact way she said everything about the kitchen, the way someone talks about a thing they have tested for 40 years and stopped questioning. I did not think about it much when I was young. It was just the way coffee smelled in our house. I am thinking about it now, because there is something happening in that cup that has nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with why a farm wife in the early part of the last century figured out, without any laboratory and without any study, that one small dried bud made the morning more manageable. And the explanation for why that is true turns out to be more interesting than the remedy itself. Most people think of coffee as a simple thing. Hot water through ground beans, a dose of caffeine to move the morning along. That is the whole picture most folks carry. And it is not wrong exactly, but it is the kind of right that leaves out almost everything worth knowing. Coffee is one of the most chemically complex things most people consume in a day. More than 1,000 compounds form during the roasting process. Acids, oils, bitter compounds, antioxidants. One of them, a compound called chlorogenic acid, does something that has been studied quietly by researchers for decades and is almost never discussed in the way people talk about their morning cup. Chlorogenic acid slows the rate at which the digestive system absorbs sugar from food. It is present in green coffee in large amounts and survives the roasting process in smaller but still meaningful amounts in the cup you pour every morning. This is the part most people never hear. The coffee you drink is already doing something to your blood sugar that has nothing to do with caffeine. Now bring in the clove, a dried clove bud, the kind you find in every kitchen spice drawer, contains one of the most studied plant compounds in traditional medicine. It is called eugenol. Eugenol is what gives cloves their particular smell, that sharp, warm, slightly numbing quality you notice when you bite into one. It is what dentists once used as a natural anesthetic before the modern synthetics arrived. It is still used in dental preparations today. It is not folklore. It is a compound with a documented history of use by physicians going back at least 500 years in European and Asian medical traditions, and considerably further than that in the Ayurvedic and Chinese medical systems that preceded them. Here is the thing about eugenol that my grandmother did not know in those terms, but that she knew in her body. It relaxes smooth muscle tissue. The walls of blood vessels are lined with smooth muscle. The walls of the digestive tract are lined with smooth muscle. When eugenol enters the body, it has a mild but measurable effect on those walls. Blood vessels open a little. The digestive system eases its grip. The faint nervous tightening that caffeine can produce in the gut and in the chest relaxes somewhat. The reason the combination works the way it does is that you have two compounds acting on the same morning in different directions that happen to complement rather than cancel each other. Caffeine pushes the body toward alertness. It narrows blood vessels slightly, raises heart rate, sharpens focus. That is the part people want. Eugenol does something different. It opens blood vessels mildly and quiets smooth muscle tension. The result is not that the caffeine stops working. The result is that the harder edge of the caffeine gets softened, energy without the jitter, alertness without the tightness in the chest. My grandmother did not have words for any of this. She had 40 years of mornings, and there is more to it than the nerves. The digestive tract on a typical morning is already working hard. The body has been in a fasting state overnight. Stomach acid rises first thing. Digestion restarts. For many people, especially older people, coffee alone accelerates that process in ways that feel uncomfortable. Loose digestion, gas that builds through the morning, a vague bloat by midday. Those complaints are familiar to almost anyone over 60 who drinks coffee. Eugenol has a long documented history as a carminative. That word has largely disappeared from everyday use, but it was common in the language of household medicine for a very long time. A carminative is something that helps the digestive system release trapped gas and settle spasming muscle. Cloves, along with ginger, fennel, and a handful of other spices, appear repeatedly in traditional medical texts specifically because of this property. German herbalists documented it. English household manuals from the 18th and 19th centuries described it. Amish communities carried this knowledge as a practical matter of daily life, not as medicine, but as cooking. They knew that certain spices did not just add flavor, they helped the body handle food. One clove in the morning coffee addresses the digestive problem before it starts, rather than waiting for the discomfort to arrive and then trying to remedy it. That is a different way of thinking about it, and it is a way of thinking that has mostly vanished. Here is what I mean. The communities that kept this kind of knowledge, Amish farms, Mennonite households, the old German and Swiss settlements that came to Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana in the 18th century, were not thinking about what to take when something hurt. They were thinking about how to build a daily life that did not produce the problem in the first place. There is a difference between those two frames, and it is not a small one. A jar of cloves on the kitchen shelf was not medicine in the way we use that word now. It was part of the kitchen. It belonged there the way vinegar belongs in the pantry, not because you reach for it when something is wrong, but because it does quiet, ongoing work when everything is right. The people who kept these habits did not separate food from health the way modern life does. They did not have a cabinet for cooking and a different cabinet for wellness. It was one cabinet, one shelf, one way of living. The separation happened gradually, and it did not happen because the old knowledge was tested and found lacking. Think about what changed after the Second World War in American kitchens. Convenience food arrived, spice use dropped, cooking from scratch became less common. The extended family household, where a grandmother was in the kitchen every day and a granddaughter watched and asked questions, was replaced by smaller households with less daily cooking and less transfer of knowledge. The woman who knew why she added cloves to the morning pot, who could explain it to her daughter and her daughter's daughter, became the last link in a chain that had run unbroken for many generations. And then she died, and the jar of cloves stayed on the shelf until someone cleaned out the kitchen and it was gone. The knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the structure that transmitted it collapsed. Now, the other part of what is happening in the cup, the part that connects to blood sugar, matters for a particular reason that goes beyond the morning. Most people over 60 in this country are managing quietly or not so quietly some version of blood sugar instability. It may not be diabetes, it may not even have a name, but the pattern is familiar. Sharp energy after a meal, followed by a drop that produces fatigue, hunger that comes faster than it should, a mid-afternoon heaviness that was not there at 40. These are signs of blood sugar cycling that many people experience as aging rather than as something that can be influenced by daily habits. The chlorogenic acid in coffee slows glucose absorption from the gut into the bloodstream. This means that the spike after eating is smaller. The drop that follows a spike is also smaller. The system runs more evenly. This has been studied. Not in large clinical trials with thousands of participants, but in smaller, careful research that has been consistent enough over enough years that it appears in serious nutritional literature. It is not a cure, it is not a treatment, it is a food compound doing what food compounds do, which is to have measurable effects on the way the body handles what it eats. Eugenol adds to this in a different way. It has demonstrated effects on insulin sensitivity in animal research and in some limited human studies. The evidence here is more preliminary. I will say that plainly because the research on cloves is not as developed as the research on coffee, and I will not claim more than the evidence supports. What is clear is that eugenol's anti-inflammatory effects are well documented, that chronic low-level inflammation is closely tied to blood sugar dysregulation in older adults, and that the two things together, reducing inflammation and moderating glucose absorption, work in the same direction. Not a miracle, not a treatment, a direction. That is the word I keep coming back to. These are not compounds that fix a broken system. They are compounds that nudge the system in a better direction when the system is still mostly working but has started to drift. That is exactly the kind of thing daily food habits can address. It is not the kind of thing a prescription handles, because a prescription is designed for a system that is past the point of nudging. Traditional communities were working in the space before the prescription. They had no prescription to fall back on, so they built daily habits out of foods and spices that did the quiet work of keeping the body from drifting too far in the wrong direction. They did not think about it in those terms. They thought about it the way my grandmother thought about it. It evens things out. There is another piece of this that I want to be honest about because it is easy to miss. The effect of adding a clove to your morning coffee is not dramatic. You are not going to sit down with your cup and stand up feeling 20 years younger. That is not what this is. What this is, and what most old food habits are when you look at them carefully, is a small, consistent, daily influence on the body over time. That is harder to sell than a dramatic result. It does not make a good headline, but it is more realistic and more honest than the way most health remedies get described. The Amish communities I grew up around did not have a culture of dramatic health interventions. They had a culture of consistent daily habits. The root cellar kept vegetables through the winter, so the family ate well in February when there was nothing growing. The sourdough starter was maintained, so the bread contained natural fermentation that did things for digestion that white store bread did not do. The apple cider vinegar crocks sat in the corner of the kitchen, not because someone decided to start a health practice, but because fermented foods were part of how this community ate. The clove in the coffee was the same kind of thing, not dramatic, consistent. Consistency is what compounds. A single clove contains a small amount of eugenol. One morning of drinking clove coffee changes nothing you could measure. A year of it, taken every morning the way my grandmother took it every morning for decades, is something else. The body responds to what it receives every day. That is not mysticism. It is ordinary physiology. The inflammation question is worth returning to because it is the thread that runs under most of what the research on cloves documents. Chronic low-level inflammation is now understood to be involved in most of the diseases that produce serious suffering in older adults. Not the inflammation of a cut or an infection, which is the body doing its proper job. The quiet, persistent, low-level inflammatory activity that shows up in the blood of people who eat a poor diet, sleep poorly, move little, and carry more stress than the body was designed to hold. Researchers have started calling this inflammaging, a combination of inflammation and aging, to describe the way chronic inflammation accelerates the deterioration that age produces on its own. Eugenol is one of the more potent natural anti-inflammatory compounds in the plant world. This is not a fringe claim. It is in the peer-reviewed research. It inhibits some of the same molecular pathways that pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs target, though at much smaller scale and without the side effects that come with those drugs. The morning cup of clove coffee is not a substitute for a doctor's care in any situation that needs a doctor, but for the daily maintenance of a body trying to hold back the drift toward chronic inflammation, it is doing real work. The joint stiffness that worsens in the morning, the fingers that swell by afternoon, the knee that aches after sitting too long. These are, in large part, inflammatory processes. They are not just the inevitable consequence of getting older, though age is a factor. They are influenced by the inflammatory environment inside the body, and that environment is influenced every single day by what the person eats and drinks. This is what my grandmother knew without the vocabulary to describe it. She knew that the people in her community who kept certain eating habits stayed more mobile into old age than people who did not. She had watched it across generations. She did not have a study. She had a lifetime of observation. There is something about the liver I want to mention because it came up in my own reading on this, and I found it more interesting than I expected. Coffee has a documented protective relationship with the liver that has been studied for decades. It is one of the more robust findings in nutrition research. People who drink coffee regularly have measurably lower rates of liver fibrosis and cirrhosis and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease than people who do not. The mechanism involves the chlorogenic acids and other antioxidant compounds in coffee that the liver processes and that appear to reduce oxidative stress in liver tissue. This is not speculation. It is one of the best supported findings in the nutritional epidemiology literature. Eugenol adds to this. There are multiple animal studies and some human studies suggesting that eugenol has hepatoprotective properties, meaning it supports liver function and reduces oxidative stress in liver tissue. Herbalists in the European and Asian traditions used cloves specifically to support digestive and liver health for centuries before any of this was studied in a laboratory. The traditional use predates the research by hundreds of years. The research did not create the knowledge, it confirmed it. The liver is involved in almost every process the body runs, from clearing toxins to regulating blood sugar to handling cholesterol. When liver function runs well, a great deal else runs better. Skin clarity improves, energy is steadier, the body handles food and waste more efficiently. Supporting the liver is supporting the system that supports everything else. 1 clove in the morning. My grandmother did not need a study. She had a clay jar on a shelf and 40 years of evidence that nobody ever wrote down. I want to take a moment here to talk about something beyond the remedy, because I think it is the larger point, and I do not want to reach the end of this without saying it. There are 2 ways to approach the daily maintenance of a body. One is reactive. You wait until something breaks, and then you attempt to fix it. This is how modern medicine primarily operates, and it is very good at what it does when a body is acutely broken. If you fall and break an arm, you want a modern physician. There is no traditional remedy for a broken arm that competes. But most of what makes old age hard is not acute breakage. It is the long, slow accumulation of drift, inflammation that builds over 20 years of poor eating, blood sugar instability that develops over decades of refined carbohydrates, a liver that has been managing industrial food since childhood, joint tissue that has been inflamed for so long it has started to deteriorate. None of these happened in a day. None of them can be fully reversed in a day. And the reactive approach, the approach that waits for the crisis before intervening, is poorly suited to problems that developed across decades. The proactive approach is different. It is built on the understanding that the body responds to what it receives every day, and that small, consistent daily inputs accumulate over years into meaningfully different outcomes. This is the logic behind the clay jar of cloves. Not a treatment, a daily habit. The kind of daily habit that does not make any observable difference on a Tuesday morning, but that produces, over 20 years, a different body than the one that did not have it. This is what the old communities understood. They did not call it preventive health. They called it how we live. The problem is that how we live changed. In the space of about 2 generations, the daily habits slowly assembled over hundreds of years through observation and transmission and the pragmatic trial and error of people who needed their bodies to work hard every day, were replaced by convenience. Packaged food replaced food grown and stored and prepared at home. Chemical flavoring replaced spices that had functional uses. White refined flour replaced the whole grain flours that contained the germ and the bran, where most of the nutritional value lived. The slow drift away from traditional eating habits was not a sudden break. It was gradual, each generation a little further from the kitchen practices of the one before, until a great deal of what had been ordinary household knowledge became unreachable. Not because it stopped being true, because the people who carried it in their daily lives were no longer alive to demonstrate it. I was fortunate. My grandmother was in that kitchen for most of my childhood. I watched her hands. I watched what she kept on the shelf and why. I did not understand most of it until I was much older and started to pay attention to why the old habits made sense. But I saw it. I had the example in front of me. Many people did not. Many people grew up in households where convenience food was simply the way food was done, where the kitchen held a microwave and a collection of boxes and the spice rack was decorative, where there was no jar of cloves on the shelf because nobody had ever told them why there should be. This is not a condemnation. It is a description of what was lost and how it was lost. Quietly, without anyone deciding to lose it. Now, here is the practical matter for anyone who wants to bring this into their morning. 1 whole clove, the dried bud, dropped into the coffee grounds before you brew. If you use a drip machine, put it right in the filter with the grounds. If you use a French press, drop it in when you add the grounds and press as usual. 1 clove is enough. The flavor in the finished cup is subtle. A faint warmth, a slight depth. Most people who do not know it is there could not identify it. It is not spiced coffee in the way that pumpkin spice coffee is spiced. It is not a flavoring. It is background, and for most people it is pleasant background. Whole cloves, not ground clove powder. The powder can be inconsistent in strength and has a tendency to become bitter in the brewing process. The whole dried bud releases its compounds slowly and evenly into the hot water and produces a more controlled result. You can buy a bag of whole cloves at any grocery store for a few dollars. It will last a very long time if you use 1 per day. If you do not make your own coffee and drink what comes from a machine or a drive-through, carry 1 clove in a small bag and drop it in the cup when you get it while the coffee is still hot. It will still steep. If you have a medical condition, especially if you are on blood thinners or have a known sensitivity to phenolic compounds, ask your physician before adding this daily. Eugenol at normal dietary amounts from a single clove is not a clinical dose of anything. But if you are already managing your health with medications, a conversation with your doctor costs nothing and takes 2 minutes. Otherwise, this is a jar of cloves on a shelf. It is as safe as anything in your kitchen. It is considerably simpler than most of what people spend money on when they are trying to support their health. 1 clove, every morning. The same way it was done in farmhouse kitchens for longer than anyone now living can remember. Here is what I keep returning to as I think about my grandmother and that clay jar. She was not trying to discover something. She was not reading about eugenol. She was not following a protocol. She was doing what her mother showed her because her mother's experience had been that it worked, and her mother's mother before that. And somewhere far back along the line was a woman who first noticed that the morning went better with the clove than without it, and began a habit that lasted for 150 years until it arrived at a kitchen in Lancaster County and a boy who asked why. The answer is that generations of lived observation is a real form of knowledge. It is not the same as a clinical trial. It is not as precise, and it cannot be generalized in the same way. But for the ordinary maintenance of an ordinary human body through the daily work of a long life, the accumulated practical wisdom of communities that depended on their bodies to function is not nothing. It is, in many cases, more than we have given it credit for. The clinical trial tells you what a compound does under controlled conditions to a particular population over a particular period. The generation of farm wives with clay jars on their shelves tells you what happened to real people in real life across many decades when they kept a particular habit. Both kinds of evidence have limits. Both kinds of evidence have something to offer. The tragedy is not that we developed better tools for understanding how things work. The tragedy is that in doing so, we came to believe that the older observations were simply ignorance waiting to be corrected, rather than careful attention waiting to be understood. Some of the old remedies, when studied, turn out not to work as described. Some of them worked by mechanisms entirely different from what the people using them believed. Some of them worked precisely as described, but for reasons that only became clear much later. The clove in the morning coffee is one of these. My grandmother did not know what eugenol was. She knew what her morning felt like, with it and without it. The research that has been done on these compounds in the years since suggests that her observation was not luck. It was the product of a community paying close practical attention to the relationship between what people ate and how they lived. And the question that stays with me after thinking about all of this is not whether the clove works. The question is what else is sitting in a clay jar on a shelf somewhere, in the memory of the last person who remembers why it is there, and how much of it we will lose before someone thinks to ask.